The following contains depictions of violence, drug use, and themes of racial discrimination and may be inappropriate for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. On August 1st, 1966, a man named Charles Whitman murdered his wife and his mother in Austin, Texas. He then took a collection of weapons, including a .30 caliber M1 carbine, to the top of the University of Texas Tower and started shooting indiscriminately. 14 people were killed and 31 were injured. One of the victims in the incident was Claire Wilson, who was shot in the abdomen and survived. Her unborn child, however, did not. This event is clearly horrible. The senseless loss of life is something that's quite difficult to stomach. And at the centre of it is this one man, Whitman. Now, I want to ask you a question, and I think I already know what the answer is going to be. Is Charles Whitman evil? An hour and a half after Whitman started his spree, he was shot dead by 2 police officers, and rightly so. He had written several letters, some addressed to his family and one written just after he had murdered his wife and mother, in which he says the following: "I don't really understand myself these days. Lately I've been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. After my death, I wish that an autopsy would be performed on me to see if there is any visible physical disorder." An autopsy was performed on Whitman, of course, and upon the initial investigation, the following discovery was made about his brain. In the middle part of the brain, above the red nucleus in the white matter below the grey centre thalamus, is a fairly well outlined tumour, about 2 by 1.5 by 1 centimetre in dimensions, greyish yellow with peripheral areas of red as blood. The glioblastoma tumour was located beneath the thalamus, and was believed to have been placing pressure on the amygdala, which is in charge of emotion and behaviour. It's thought that this pressure on the amygdala is what caused Whitman's unusual aggression. Some experts think that the tumour played an important role in the shooting and others don't, but there's a very real possibility that the shooting would never have happened if it weren't for the tumour. And if that's the case, then let me ask you again, is Charles Whitman evil? The idea that our actions and behaviours are caused by external stimuli like upbringing and genetics and brain tumours is called determinism. If you knew everything about a person, every neuron in their brain, all of their fears, their woes, everything that led them to this point, you could in theory predict the exact sentence that they were going to say next. Free will is an illusion. Most people disagree with this idea. Most people think that we do in fact have free will, and that we're the authors of our own actions. So it's very likely that the majority of you don't think that free will is an illusion. And ultimately it doesn't really matter. A lot of this is semantics anyway. What's important for the argument that I'm trying to make is if you hold in your mind the idea that the behaviour of human beings is influenced by factors outside of their control. Here's some examples of what I mean. When buying wine, people are more likely to buy French wine when French music is playing in a wine section. When asked about it afterwards, they have no idea that the music influenced their decision. If you show someone footage of 2 cars crashing into each other and then ask them how fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other, their estimate of how fast the cars were travelling changes depending on what verb you use in the sentence. Because how fast were the cars going when they contacted sounds a lot less dramatic than how fast were the cars going when they smashed. In The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, Oliver Sacks recounts a patient who, just after her 89th birthday, becomes full of life and energetic. She even started flirting with younger men, and the cause was latent neurosyphilis stimulating her cerebral cortex and producing atypical behaviour. Either our actions and behaviours and thoughts are caused by a chain of causal events, or randomness. But neither of those two things leaves any room for free will, if you really think about it. The only reason you ever do anything is because you want to, for whatever reason, and that feeling has to come from somewhere. Unless you think there's something magical about the human brain, that it's made of pixie dust or something, it should be quite clear to see that the human brain is a physical object that's bound by the deterministic nature of the sciences. Sam Harris in particular makes a very convincing case for determinism, and I'd recommend anyone interested in the topic to read his book or watch his lecture at the Sydney Festival of Dangerous Ideas. There's also a summarised version of his argument on one of the Joe Rogan podcasts, and I've linked them all below. In Harris's lecture, he seeks to answer the question, why does it matter? Does it really matter whether we author our own thoughts or we're just bags of meat who are just ambling through causal events? As he says himself, an area where it starts to really matter is criminal justice. Determinism has a profound effect on the nature of criminality, evil, premeditated murder, and punishment. I want to build on this idea further. How does determinism affect criminal justice? There are 5 objectives of criminal justice: restoration, incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, and retribution. If we look at this through the lens of causal determinism, then one of these objectives no longer makes scientific sense. Retribution is the idea that someone should be punished because they deserve it. But if criminals commit crimes because of their nature, or because of external influences, then it doesn't really follow that we should make them suffer for their crimes. Inflicting pain and torment on a person because of their actions presupposes the idea of an evil that they can freely author. Now, this is where we need to get careful with terminology. Removing retribution as an objective doesn't mean that it's no one's fault when a crime is committed. It's often extremely clear whose fault it is. All it means is that people aren't incarcerated because they deserve to be incarcerated. They're incarcerated for the other 4 objectives. They're incarcerated for reasons that we can understand through data and logic. We would still have prisons and rehabilitation programs and harsh sentences to act as a deterrent. So we need to get more specific about this. And if you only pay attention to one part of this video, please let it be the next sentence. Determinism changes criminality from a collection of evil people into a problem for which we can engineer a solution. This idea isn't new, but its antithesis is still a cliche that plagues the debates and still influences criminal justice systems the world over. Let's talk about murder. Now, homicide is a pretty easy metric to work with. People are either murdered or they're not, and it's quite a serious crime. For the most part, homicide rates have been trending downwards for decades, even centuries. Here in the UK, the murder rate has been steadily declining, and the number of murders in 2017 was 42% less than in 1990. And this trend can be seen in most other countries in the world. The world seems to be getting less murdery. There are outliers like Venezuela, where murder is now the 3rd leading cause of death. Here in the UK, it's 19th. Regardless of this downward trend, people do still get murdered, obviously. Homicide accounts for about 400,000 deaths per year worldwide. That's about 1% of deaths. So it is a problem, and it's a problem that's worth solving. And through the lens of free will, it's easy to dismiss the problem and say, murderers are evil and they deserve to be punished. But through the lens of determinism, murder rates are surprisingly predictable. Alcohol consumption, drug consumption, black markets, having more testosterone, warm weather, and relative poverty are all factors that correlate with higher murder rates. It's predictable, it's determined. Without looking at the data, it's easy to assume that the easiest solution is just to lock murderers away for a longer amount of time, give them harsher sentences. But I really believe that that sentiment comes from a place of wanting retribution. Wanting some kind of punishment to be inflicted on murderers because they deserve it. Murderers have willingly committed an evil act and they deserve to suffer for it. This is not necessarily the best option and could actually be harmful to society. I'm going to use 2 examples to demonstrate my point.
Mike Barry with sports, Storm Field with the weather, and the Eyewitness News team.
Good evening. We're coming off the bloodiest year in the history of New York, 1,784 homicides. And we're starting off the new year with at least 10 murders in the city today.
And the statistics this year are really grim. Every day in New York State, 6 people are murdered, and 5 of those, count them, 5, are murdered right here in New York City. The total, the record number for the year, 1,787 people killed through someone else's design.
Anyone living in New York City in the 1980s would be forgiven for thinking that it was unpleasant. Like virtually every other city in America, New York was experiencing a crime wave that was more violent and more murderous than anything it had ever seen in its history. At its peak in 1990, 2,245 people were murdered in the city, compared to 311 in 2019. More New Yorkers lost their lives to murder in that decade than did in 9/11, 6 times over. The culprit?
Crack.
Crack cocaine. Crime had been rising steadily since the 60s, the reasons for which are largely unknown, but the surge of crime in the 80s was almost certainly due to this world-destroying drug. Crack was the result of a glut in the American cocaine market in the 1970s. There was so much powder cocaine being shipped into the country that the price dropped hugely, and drug dealers had to adapt. Crack cocaine is a solid, rock-like substance, and can be sold in smaller quantities to more people, and ultimately to a larger profit. The high that users experience from crack cocaine is also instantaneous, and it's more intense than powder cocaine, but it doesn't last as long. All this makes for a drug that keeps users coming back for more. Of course, the drug was, and is still, mostly, illegal, and it has been since 1914. This means that when a customer doesn't pay you, or some rivals roll into your turf, or the authorities don't take kindly to what you're doing, you can't just take the issue to a tribunal. You're operating outside of society. If you want the business to keep going, you have to use violence to enforce it, hence murder. But just as the crime wave began to hit its peak, it began to fall drastically. By 1995, the murder rate per 100,000 residents was 16, compared to 30 in 1990. By the year 2000, it had dropped to 8.4. Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner talk about this period of New York's history in the opening chapter to Freakonomics. As they say, the most likely cause in the drop in crime rate in New York was, among other things, abortion. Abortion was legalized in New York in 1970, and it was decriminalized nationwide in 1973. This opens up the possibility for women to have control over their reproduction, especially single women in impoverished areas. 20 years after abortion becomes available, crime drops off a cliff. Those 20-somethings who would have turned to crack and crime through desperation were never even born in the first place. A social change determined the crime rate, but the damage was already done. The public debate in the 80s was much the same as what we see today. Should we treat the users and even the pushers as victims, or should we come down hard on them as a deterrent?
Now, none of us really know what to do. All we know for certain is that what we have been doing has not worked.
The Mayor's in School program was working. A Missy program which hired youth after school. We're talking about jobs. That was one program that worked.
How many people did that divert from dealing cocaine?
500 youth that it hired.
And my child loves me and I love him and he has a problem. And he's had a problem for almost 2 years now. And I've been through this system and I am educated and I know we need to have ways to help our youngsters.
And where is that? Well, I think that's what we're suggesting we done.
Just a minute.
What helps?
I want to
Yes, thank you.
You talk about programs and idea. You arrest, you rearrest, you bust the drug houses, and you confiscate money. What are you doing with that money? Why that money cannot be put into some program to rehabilitate these children?
Of course, the latter argument won. During this decade, the Reagan administration wrapped up the war on drugs that Nixon had started in his famous speech in 1971. Punishments became harsher, much harsher, even for recreational users. The number of incarcerations nationwide increased from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. And due to the crack epidemic, crack users were targeted heavily over powder cocaine users. The weight ratio required to trigger criminal penalties between the two drugs was 100 to 1. What this means is that someone caught with this much crack cocaine would receive a minimum sentence of 5 years, and it would take this much powder cocaine to trigger the same sentence. 80% of crack users were African Americans, usually in inner cities, whereas powder cocaine users were much more likely to be white suburbanites or Wall Street yuppies. By 1989, 1/4 of African American men in their 20s were either in prison, on parole, or on probation. By 1995, it was 1/3. Some of you may be thinking, and it's a perfectly reasonable thought, how do we know that the war on drugs wasn't the thing that actually caused crime to fall in the 90s? Couldn't the economists be wrong about the abortion theory? Well, first of all, New York's most violent year, 1990, happened 10 years after the Reagan administration had ramped up the war on drugs. Secondly, the murder rate dropped suddenly in the mid-90s, despite incarceration rates increasing steadily before that. And the murder rate didn't suddenly shoot back up again when incarceration dropped off in the late 90s and early 2000s. And thirdly, let's look at the second example I had to illustrate my earlier point. Zurich, Switzerland, is a lovely, clean, cosmopolitan city. But Zurich was a relatively seedy and troubled city not that long ago. In the 80s and 90s, Switzerland experienced a heroin epidemic that was most prevalent in the German-speaking part of the country. This was accompanied by numerous devastating health crises, including an increased prevalence of HIV. In 1986, Switzerland reported the highest number of cases of HIV in Western Europe at 3,252, followed by the UK with 2,600, despite the UK having a population 9 times larger. Hundreds of people would gather in Zurich every day, taking heroin, sharing needles. People were dying of drug overdoses on the street, in front of political buildings and high-profile establishments. According to Rita Anoni-Mangi, a director of heroin treatment at the Hospital University of Geneva, it was the equivalent of people dying on the White House lawn. Drug-related deaths, property crime and murder were high and climbing. The country was on the edge of catastrophe, and their conservative history on drug policing could have easily dictated their next move, cracking down hard on drug users, increasing law enforcement. But that's not what they did. Instead, they focused on treatment of heroin users and on prevention of new users. Methadone clinics, safe injection rooms, needle exchanges, and even the prescription of heroin to people with long-term opiate dependency were some of the strategies used to tackle the crisis. The criticism of these programs was that it would encourage new users to start taking the drug, or the drugs in the program would somehow end up back on the black market. But neither of those things actually happened. New heroin users decreased from 850 in 1990 to 150 in 2002. HIV cases fell rapidly, as did crime and drug-related deaths. The per capita murder rate has been declining since the initiatives and is now at a historic low. Faced with a public health crisis, the Swiss government treated criminality as a problem to solve, rather than a collection of evil people to punish. And it worked. Finally, what about non-drug related crime? Should we still have the same method of scientific categorization for violent murderers? The answer may lie in looking at recidivism or reoffending rates. One of the world's lowest recidivism rates is found in Norway at 20%, where prisoners are given widescreen TVs and big windows to let more sunlight in. The idea is that treating prisoners well and giving them a sense of community will make them more likely to integrate with society afterwards. And it does seem to work. Compare this to the United States, with a recidivism rate of about 60%. This is where people start to get a bit uncomfortable, I think, especially depending on what country you're from and your political leanings. The idea that we should be treating prisoners with dignity and to make them comfortable sounds so counterintuitive to the perceived objective of criminal justice. But ask yourself this. In a perfect world, what would crime look like? What objective should criminal justice systems aim for? Surely the answer is less crime, fewer criminals, lower reoffending rates. And the way to achieve that aim is to base a criminal justice system on scientific inquiry. But we have a problem. Data on recidivism is not good in the slightest. Different countries use different methods and timescales to answer the question how many prisoners reoffend after getting out of prison. Take this example. Singapore reports a re-arrest rate of 24% based on a 1-year follow-up, and Germany reports a 46% reconviction rate and only tests this in a 3-year follow-up. Austria conducts follow-up studies every year for 4 years after release from prison, whereas Latvia only does it after 29 months. The problem with this is that it's really difficult then to see what factors are actually contributing to lower recidivism rates, and if we can't work that out, then there's no way for us to actually lower them. The authors of this review of data recommend a reporting checklist be used by every government to make sure that their data is aligned. We need everyone to adopt the same methods of recording this. We need to realise that the sheer volume of data on reoffending rates is untapped gold. If we harness it, we can work out why people reoffend, we can work out why people commit crimes, and we can save lives. We need to reform our justice systems, take out the emotion, take out the need to punish people because they deserve it. Make it about science, make it about data. We need a world of justice without retribution.